Okay, so we are picking up tonight with Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. We're on chapter 9, and the goal would be to read 9, 10, and 11 tonight, but my dogs are in rare form, so we'll see how that goes. Last night, we met Pearl and got to see all her quirky, kind of crazy, fairy-like is how they describe her in the book, traits, which is fun. And I'm not entirely unconvinced that this book is one giant run-on sentence. Like, it's pretty hard to read out loud because you never know exactly what he's trying to say. When you start a sentence, it could go on for a page and a half. Nathaniel Hawthorne would not get a 5 on the AP exam, is what I am saying. So tonight we're picking up chapter 9, which is called The Leech in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Under the appellation of Roger Chillingworth, the reader will remember was a hidden another name, which its former wearer had resolved should never more be spoken. It has been related how in the crowd that witnessed Hester Prynne's ignominious exposure stood a man, elderly, travel-worn, who, just emerging from the perilous wilderness, beheld a woman in whom he hoped to find embodied the warmth and cheerfulness of home, set up as a type of sin before the people. Her matronly frame was trodden under all men's feet. Infamy was babbling around her in the public marketplace. For her kindred, should the tidings ever reach them, and for the companions of her unspotted life, there remained nothing but the contagion of her dishonor, which would not fail to be distributed in strict accordance and proportion with the intimacy and sacredness of their previous relationship. Then why, since the choice was with himself, should the individual whose connection with the fallen woman had been the most intimate and sacred of them all come forward to vindicate his claim to an inheritance so little desirable? He resolved not to be pilloried beside her on the pedestal of shame. Unknown to all but Hester Prynne, and possessing the lock and key of her silence, he chose to withdraw his name from the roll of mankind, and, as regarded his former ties and interest, to vanish out of life as completely as if he had indeed lay at the bottom of the ocean, whither rumor had long ago consigned him. This purpose once effected, new interests would immediately spring up, and likewise a new purpose, dark, it is true, if not guilty, but force enough to engage the full strength of his faculties. In pursuance of this resolve, he took up his residence in the Puritan town as Roger Chillingworth, without other introduction than the learning and intelligence of which he possessed more than a common measure. As his studies at a previous period of his life had made him extensively acquainted with the medical science of the day, it was as a physician that he presented himself, and as such was cordially received. Skillful men of the medical and chirurgical profession were of rare occurrence in the colony. They seldom, it would appear, partook of the religious zeal that brought other emigrants across the sea. In their researches of the human frame, we might be done for the night, the doctor and our farm. In their researches of the human frame, it may be that the higher and more subtle faculties of such men were materialized, and that they lost the spiritual view of existence amid the intricacies of that wondrous mechanism, which seemed to involve art, enough to comprise all life within itself. At all events, the health of the good town of Boston, so far as medicine had aught to do with it, had hitherto lain in the guardianship of an aged deacon and apothecary, whose piety and godly deportment were stronger testimonials in his favor than any that he could have produced in the shape of a diploma. The only surgeon was one who combined the occasional exercise of that noble art of the daily and habitual flourish of a razor. To such a professional body, Roger Chillingworth was a brilliant acquisition. He soon manifested his familiarity with the ponderous and imposing machinery of antique physic, in which every remedy contained a multitude of far-fetched and heterogeneous ingredients, as elaborately compounded as if the proposed result had been the elixir of life. In his Indian captivity, moreover, he had gained much knowledge of the properties of native herbs and roots. Nor did he conceal from his patients that these simple medicines, nature's boon to the untutored savage, had quite as large a share of his own competence as the European pharmacopoeia, which so many learned doctors had spent centuries in elaborating. This learned stranger was exemplary as regarded at least the outward forms of religious life, and early after his arrival had chosen for his spiritual guide the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale. The young divine, whose scholar-like renown still lived in Oxford, was considered by his more fervent admirers as little less than a heavenly ordained apostle, destined, should he live and labor for the ordinary term of life, to do as great deeds for the now feeble New England church as the early fathers had achieved for the infancy of the Christian faith. About this period, however, the health of Mr. Dimsdale had evidently begun to fail. By those best acquainted with his habits, the paleness of the young minister's cheek was accounted for by his too earnest devotion to study, his scrupulous fulfillment of parochial duty, and, more than all, to the fasts and vigils of which he made a frequent practice, in order to keep the grossness of his earthly state from clogging and obscuring his spiritual lamp. Some declared that if Mr. Dimsdale were really going to die, it was cause enough that the world was not worthy to be any longer trodden by his feet. He himself, on the other hand, with characteristic humility, avowed his belief that if Providence should see fit to remove him, it would be because of his own unworthiness to perform its humblest mission here on earth. With all this difference of opinion as to the cause of his decline, there could be no question of the fact. His form grew emaciated. His voice, though still rich and sweet, had a certain melancholy prophecy of decay in it. He was often observed, and any slight alarm or other sudden accident, to put his hand over his heart with a first of a flush and then a paleness indicative of pain. Such was the young clergyman's condition, and so imminent the prospect of his dawning light, that his dawning light would be extinguished, all untimely, when Mr. Roger Chillingworth made his advent to the town. His first entry on the scene, a few people could tell whence, dropping down as if it were out of the sky or starting from the nether earth, had an aspect of mystery, which was easily heightened to be miraculous. He was now known to be a man of skill. It was observed that he gathered herbs and blossoms of wildflowers and dug up roots and plucked off twigs from the forest trees that one acquainted with hidden virtues and what was valueless to common eyes. He was heard to speak of Sir Kenelm Digby and other famous men whose scientific attainments were esteemed hardly less than supernatural, as having been his correspondents and associates. Why, with such rank in the learned world, had he come hither? What could he, whose sphere was in great cities, be seeking in this wilderness? In answer to this query, a rumor gained ground, and however absurd, was entertained by some very sensible people, that heaven had wrought an absolute miracle by transporting an eminent doctor of physic from a German university bodily through the air and setting him down at the door of Mr. Dimsdale's study. Individuals of wiser faith indeed, who knew that heaven promotes its purposes without aiming at the stage effect of what is called miraculous interposition, were inclined to see a provincial hand in Roger Chillingworth's so opportune arrival. This idea was countenanced by a strong interest which the physician ever manifested in the young clergyman. He attached himself to him as a parishioner and sought to win a friendly regard and confidence from his naturally reserved sensibility. He expressed great alarm at his pastor's state of health, but was anxious to attempt the cure, and, if early undertaken, seemed not despondent of a favorable result. The elders and deacons, the motherly dames, and the young and fair maidens of Mr. Dimsdale's flock were alike important that he should make a trial of the physician's frankly offered skill. Mr. Dimsdale gently repelled their entreaties. "I need no medicine," said he. But how could the young minister say so when every successive Sabbath his cheek was paler and thinner and his voice more tremulous than before? When it had now become a constant habit rather than a casual gesture to press his hand over his heart. Was he weary of his labors? Did he wish to die? These questions were solemnly propounded to Mr. Dimsdale as the elder ministers of Boston and the deacons of his church who, to use their own phrase, dealt with him on the sin of rejecting the aid which Providence so manifestly held out. He listened in silence and finally promised to confer with the physician. "Were it God's will," said the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale, when in fulfillment of this pledge, he requested old Roger Chillingworth's professional advice, "I could be well content that my labors and my sorrows and my sins and my pains should shortly end with me, and what is earthly of them be buried in my grave, and the spiritual go with me into the eternal state, rather than that you should put your skill to the proof in my behalf." "Ah," said Roger Chillingworth, with a quietness which, whether imposed or natural, marked all his deportment. "It is thus that a young clergyman is apt to speak. Youthful men, not having taken a deep root, give up their hold on life so easily, and saintly men who walk with God on earth would fain be away to walk with him on the golden pavements of the New Jerusalem." "Nay," joined the young minister, putting his hand to his heart, with a flush of pain flitting over his brow. "Were I worthier to walk there, I could be better content to toil here. Good men never interpret themselves too meanly." "Good men ever interpret themselves too meanly," said the physician. In this manner, the mysterious old Roger Chillingworth became the medical advisor to the Reverend Mr. Dimsdale. As not only the disease interested the physician, but he was strongly moved to look into the character and qualities of the patient. These two men, so different in age, came gradually to spend much time together. For the sake of the minister's health and to enable the leach together plants with healing balms in them, they took long walks on the seashore or in the forest, mingling various walks with the plash and murmur of the waves and the solemn wind anthem among the treetops. Often, likewise, one was the guest of the other in his place of study and retirement. There was a fascination for the minister in the company of the man of science, in whom he recognized an intellectual cultivation of no moderate depth of scope, together with a range of freedom of ideas that he would have vainly looked for among members of his own profession. In truth, he was startled, if not shocked, to find this attribute in the physician. Mr. Dimsdale was a true priest, a true religionist, with the reverential sentiment largely developed in an order of mind that impeded itself powerfully along the track of creed and wore its passage continually deeper with the lapse of time. In no state of society would he have been what is called a man of liberal views. It would always be essential to his peace to feel pressure of faith about him, supporting while it confined him within its iron framework. Not the less, however, though with a tremulous enjoyment, did he feel the occasional relief of looking at the universe through the medium of another kind of intellect than those which he had habitually held converse. It was as if a window were thrown open, admitting a freer atmosphere into the close and stifled study, where his life was wasting itself away amid lamplight or obstructive daybeams, and the musty fragrance, be it sensual or mortal, that exhales from books. The air was too fresh and chill to be long breathed for comfort, so the minister and the physician with him withdrew again within the limits of what their church confined as orthodox. Thus Roger Chillingworth scrutinized his patient carefully, both as he saw him in his ordinary life, keeping an accustomed pathway in the range of thoughts familiar to him, and as he appeared when thrown amidst other moral scenery, the novelty of which might call out something new to the surface of his character. He deemed it essential, it would seem, to know the man before attempting to do him good. Wherever there is a heart and an intellect, the diseases of the physical frame are tinged with the peculiarity of these. In Arthur Dimsdale, thought and imagination were so active and sensibility so intense that the bodily infirmity would likely to have its groundwork there. So Roger Chillingworth, a man of skill, the kind and friendly physician, strove to go deep into his patient's bosom, delving among his principles, prying into his recollections, and probing everything with a cautious touch, like a treasure seeker in a dark cavern. Few secrets can escape an investigator who has an opportunity and license to undertake such a quest and skill to follow it up. A man burdened with a secret should especially avoid the intimacy of his physician. If the latter possessed native sagacity, and a nameless something more, let's call it intuition. If he showed no intrusive egotism, nor disagreeably prominent characteristics of his own, if he had the power, which must be born with him, to bring his mind into such an affinity with his patients that this last shall unawares have spoken what he imagines himself only to have thought, if such revelations be received without tumult and acknowledged not so often by an uttered sympathy as by silence, an inarticulate breath, and here and there a word to indicate that all is understood, if to these qualifications of a confidant be joined the advantages afforded by his recognized character as a physician, then at some inevitable moment will the soul of that sufferer be dissolved and flow forth in a dark and transparent stream, bringing all of its mysteries into the daylight. Roger Chillingworth possessed all, or most, of the attributes above enumerated. Nevertheless, time went on. A kind of intimacy, as we have said, grew up between these two cultivated minds, which has as wide a field as the whole sphere of human thought and study to meet upon. They discussed every topic of ethics and religion, of public affairs and private character. They talked much on both sides of matters that seemed personal to themselves, and yet no secret, such as the physician fancied must exist there, ever stole out of the minister's consciousness and into his companion's ear. The latter had suspicions, indeed, that even the neighborhood of Mr. that even the nature of Mr. Dimmesdale's bodily disease had never fairly been revealed to him. It was a strange reserve. After a time, at a hint from Roger Chillingworth and the friends of Mr. Dimmesdale, effected an arrangement by which the two were lodged in the same house, so that every ebb and flow of the minister's lifetime might pass under the eye of his anxious and attached physician. There was much joy throughout the town when this greatly desirable object was attained. It was held to be the best possible measure for the young clergyman's welfare, unless, indeed, as often urged by such as felt authorized to do so, that he had selected someone of the many blooming damsels spiritually devoted to him to become his devoted wife. This latter step, however, there was no present prospect that Arthur Dimmesdale would be prevailed upon to take. He rejected all suggestions of the kind, as if priestly celibacy were one of his articles of church discipline. Doomed by his own choice, therefore, as Mr. Dimmesdale so evidently was, to eat his unsavory morsel always at another's board, and endure the lifelong chill which must be his lot who seeks to warm himself only by another's fireside, it truly seemed that this sagacious, experienced, benevolent old physician, with his concord of paternal and reverential love for the young pastor, was the very man of all mankind to be constantly within reach of his voice. The new abode of the two friends was with a pious widow of good social rank, who dwelt in a house covering pretty neatly the site on which the venerable structure of King's Chapel has since been built. It had the graveyard, originally Isaac Johnson's home field, on one side, and so was well adapted to call up serious reflections suited to their respective employments in both minister and man of physic. The motherly care of the good widow assigned to Mr. Dimmesdale a front apartment with sunny exposure and heavy window curtains to create a noontide shadow when desirable. The walls were hung round with tapestry, said to be from the Goblin looms, and at all events representing the scriptural story of David and Bathsheba and Nathan the prophet in color still unfaded, but which made the fair woman of the scene almost as grimly picturesque as the woe-denouncing seer. Here the pale clergyman piled up his library, rich with parchment-bound folios of the fathers and the lore of rabbis and the monkish erudition of which the Protestant divines, even while they vilified and decried the class of writers, were yet constrained often to avail themselves. On the other side of the house, old Roger Chillingworth arranged his study and laboratory. Not such a modern man of science would reckon even tolerably complete, but provided with a distilling apparatus and the means of compounding drugs and chemicals, which the practiced alchemist knew well how to turn to purpose. With such commodiousness of situation, the two learned persons sat themselves down, each in his own domain, yet familiarly passing from one apartment to the other, and bestowing a mutual and not incurious inspection into one another's business. And the Reverend Dr. Dimmesdale's best discerning friends, as we have intimated, very reasonably imagined that the hand of Providence had done all this for the purpose, besought in so many public and domestic and secret prayers, of restoring the young minister to health. But it must now be said, another portion of the community had latter begun to take its own view of the relation betwixt Mr. Dimmesdale and the mysterious old physician. When an uninstructed multitude attempts to see with its eyes, it was exceedingly apt to be deceived. When, however, it forms its judgment, as it usually does, on the intuitions of its great and warm heart, the conclusions thus attained are often so profound and so unerring as to possess the character of true supernaturally revealed. The people, in the case of which we speak, could justify its prejudice against Roger Chillingworth by no fact or argument worthy of serious refutation. There was an aged handicraftsman, it is true, who had been a citizen of London at the period of Sir Thomas Overbury's murder, now some 30 years agone. He testified to having seen the physician, under some other name, for which the narrator of the story has now forgotten, in company with Dr. Foreman, the famous conjurer, who was implicated in the affair of Overbury. 2 or 3 individuals hinted that the man of skill during his Indian captivity had enlarged his medical attainments by joining in incantations of the savage priests, who were universally acknowledged to be powerful enchanters, often performing seemingly miraculous cures by their skill in the black art. A large number, and many of these were persons of such sober sense and practical observation that their opinions would have been valuable in other matters, affirmed that Roger Chillingworth's aspect had undergone a remarkable change while he had dwelt in town, and especially since his abode with Mr. Dimmesdale. At first his expression had been calm, meditative, scholar-like. Now there was seemingly something ugly and evil in his face, which they had not previously noticed, and which grew still the more obvious to sight the oftener they looked upon him. According to the vulgar idea, the fire in his laboratory had been brought from the lower regions and was fed with infernal fuel. And so, as might be expected, his visage was getting sooty with the smoke. To sum up the matter, it grew to be widely diffused opinion that the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, like many other personage of especial sanctity in all ages of the Christian world, was haunted either by Satan himself or Satan's emissary in the guise of old Roger Chillingworth. This diabolical agent had the divine permission for a season to burrow into the clergyman's intimacy and plot against his soul. No sensible man, it was confessed, could doubt on which side the victory would turn. The people looked with an unshaken hope to see the minister come forth out of the conflict, transfigured with the glory which he would unquestionably win. Meanwhile, nevertheless, it was sad to think of the perchance mortal agony through which he must struggle towards his triumph. Alas, to judge from the gloom and terror in the depths of the poor minister's eyes, the battle was a sore one, and the victory anything but secure. Chapter 10, The Leech and His Patient. Old Roger Chillingworth, throughout his life, had been calm in temperament, kindly, though not of warm affections, but ever, and in all relations with the world, pure and upright man. He had begun an investigation, as he imagined, with the severe and equal integrity of a judge, desirous only of truth, even as if the question involved no more than the air-drawn lines and figures of a geometrical problem, instead of human passions and wrongs inflicted on himself. But as he proceeded, a terrible fascination, a kind of fierce, though still calm, necessity seized the old man within its grip, and never set him free again until he had done all its bidding. He now dug into the poor clergyman's heart, like a miner searching for gold, or rather like a sexton delving into a grave, possibly in quest of a jewel that had been buried on the dead man's bosom, but likely to find nothing save mortality and corruption. Alas for his own soul, if these were what he sought. Sometimes, A light glimmered out of the physician's eyes, burning blue and ominous, like the reflection of a furnace, or let us say, like one of those gleams of ghastly fire that darted from Bunyan's awful doorway in the hillside and quivered on the pilgrim's face. The soil where this dark miner was working had perchance shown indications that encouraged him. This man, said he, at one such moment to himself, pure as they deem him, all spiritual as he seems, hath inherited a strong animal nature from his father or his mother. Let us dig a little further in the direction of this vein. Then, after long search into the minister's dim interior, and turning over many precious materials in the shape of high aspirations for the welfare of his race, warm love of souls, pure sentiment, natural piety, strengthened by thought and study and illuminated by revelation, all of which was invaluable gold, was perhaps no better than rubbish to the seeker. He would turn back, discouraged, and begin his quest towards another point. He groped along steadily, with as cautious a tread and as wary an outlook as a thief entering the chamber where a man lies only half asleep, or, it may be, broad awake, with the purpose to steal the very treasure which this man guards the apple of his eye. In spite of his premeditated carefulness, the floor would now and then creak, his garments would rustle, the shadow of his presence in a forbidden proximity would be thrown across his victim. In other words, Mr. Dimsdale, whose sensibility of nerve often produced the effect of spiritual intuition, would become vaguely aware that something inimical to his peace had thrust itself into relation with him. The old Roger Chillingworth, too, had perceptions that were almost intuitive. And when the minister threw his startled eyes towards him, there the physician sat, his kind, watchful, sympathizing, but never intrusive friend. Yet Mr. Dimsdale would perhaps have seen this individual's character more perfectly if certain morbidities, to which sick hearts are liable, had not rendered him suspicious of all mankind. Trusting no man as his friend, he could not recognize his enemy when the latter actually appeared. He therefore still kept up a familiar intercourse with him, daily receiving the old physician into his study or visiting the laboratory, and, for recreation's sake, watching the process by which weeds were converted into drugs of potency. One day, leaning his forehead on his hand and his elbow on the sill of the open window that looked towards the graveyard, he talked with Roger Chillingworth while the old man was examining a bundle of unsightly plants. "Where?" asked he, with a look of askance at them, for it was a clergyman's peculiarity that he seldom nowadays looked straight forth at any object, whether human or inanimate. "Where, my kind doctor, did you gather those herbs with such a dark, flabby leaf?" "Even in the graveyard here at hand," answered the physician, continuing his employment. "They are new to me. I found them growing on the grave, which bore no tombstone, no other memorial of a dead man, save these ugly weeds that have taken upon themselves to keep him in remembrance. They grew out of his heart and typify, it may be, some hideous secret that was buried with him, and which he had done better to confess during his lifetime." "Perchance," said Mr. Dimsdale, "he earnestly desired it, but could not." "And wherefore?" rejoined the physician. "Wherefore not, since all the powers of nature call so earnestly for the confession of sin, that these black weeds have sprung out of the buried heart to make manifest an unspoken crime." "That, good sir, is but a fantasy of yours," replied the minister. "There can be, if I forebode aright, no power short of the divine mercy to disclose, whether by unuttered words or by type or emblem, the secrets that may be buried within a human heart. The heart, making itself guilty of such secrets, must perforce hold them until the day when all hidden things shall be revealed. Nor have I so read or interpreted Holy Writ as to understand that the disclosure of human thoughts and deeds then to be made, it is intended as a part of the retribution. That surely were a shallow view of it. No, these revelations, unless I greatly err, are meant merely to promote the intellectual satisfaction of all intelligent beings, who will stand waiting on that day and see the dark problem of his life made plain. A knowledge of men's hearts will be needful to the completest solution of that problem. And I conceive, moreover, that the hearts holding such miserable secrets as you speak of will yield them up at that last day, not with reluctance, but with a joy unutterable. Then why not reveal them here? asked Roger Chillingworth, glancing quietly aside at the minister. Why should not the guilty ones sooner avail themselves of this unutterable solace? They mostly do, said the clergyman, gripping hard at his breast, as if afflicted with an important. I just can't talk today. Important throb of pain. Many, many a poor soul had given its confidence to me, not only on the deathbed, but while strong in life and fair in reputation. And ever after such an outpouring, oh, what a relief have I witnessed in those simple brethren, even as in one who at last draws free air after long stifling with his own polluted breath. How can it be otherwise? Why should a wretched man, guilty, we will say, of murder, prefer to keep the dead corpse buried in his own heart rather than fling it forth at once and let the universe take care of it? Yet some men bury their secrets thus, observed the calm physician. True, there are such men, answered Mr. Dimsdale, but not to suggest more obvious reasons, it may be that they are kept silent in the very constitution of their nature. Or, can we not suppose it, guilty as they may be, retaining nevertheless a zeal for God's glory and man's welfare, they shrink from displaying themselves black and filthy in the view of men, because thenceforth no good can be achieved by them, no evil of the past be redeemed by better service. So, to their own unutterable torment, they go about among their fellow creatures, looking pure as new-fallen snow, while their hearts are all speckled and spotted with iniquity, of which they cannot rid themselves. These men deceive themselves. These men deceive themselves, said Roger Chillingworth, with somewhat more emphasis than usual, and making a slight gesture with his forefinger. They fear to take up the shame that rightfully belongs to them. Their love for man, their zeal for God's service. These holy impulses may or may not coexist in their hearts with the evil inmates to which their guilt unbarred the door. Des. And which must needs propagate a hellish breed within them. But if they seek to glorify God, that let them not lift heavenward their unclean hands. If they would serve their fellow men, let them do it by making manifest the power and reality of conscience and constraining them to be penitential, and constraining them to penitential self-abasement. Wouldst thou have me to believe, O wise and pious friend, that a false show can be better, can be more for God's glory or man's welfare than God's own truth? Trust me, such men deceive themselves. It may be so, said the young clergyman indifferently, as waiving a discussion that he considered irrelevant and unseasonable. He had a ready faculty, indeed, of escaping from any topic that agitated his too sensitive and nervous temperament. But now I would ask of my well-skilled physician whether, in good sooth, he deems me to have profited by his kindly care of this weak frame of mine. Before Roger Chillingworth could answer, they heard the clear, wild laughter of a young child's voice proceeding from the adjacent burial ground. Looking instinctively from the open window, for it was summertime, the minister beheld Hester Prynne and little Pearl passing along the footpath that traversed the enclosure. Pearl looked as beautiful as the day, but was in one of those moods of perverse merriment which, whenever they occurred, seemed to remove her entirely from the sphere of human sympathy or human contact. She now skipped irreverently from one grave to another until, coming to the broad, flat, memorial tombstone that of a departed worthy and perhaps Isaac Johnson himself, she began to dance upon it. In reply to her mother's command and entreaty that she would behave more decorously, little Pearl paused to gather the prickly burrs from the tall burdock which grew beside the tomb. Taking a handful of these, she arranged them along the lines of the scarlet letter that decorated the maternal bosom, to which the burrs, as their nature was, tenaciously adhered. Hester did not flick them off. Roger Chillingworth had by this time approached the window and smiled grimly down. There is no law, nor reverence of authority, no regard for human ordinances or opinions, right or wrong, mixed up with that child's composition, remarked he, as much to himself as to his companion. I saw her the other day bespatter the governor himself with water at the cattle trough in Spring Lane. What in heaven's name is she? Is the imp altogether evil? Hath she affections? Hath she any discoverable principle of being? None save the freedom of broken law, answered Mr. Dimmesdale in a quiet way, as if he had been discussing the point within himself. Whether capable of good, I know not. The child probably overheard their voices, for, looking up to the window with a bright and naughty smile of mirth and intelligence, she threw one of the prickly burrs at Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale. The sensitive clergyman shrank with nervous dread from the light missile. Detecting his emotion, Pearl clapped her little hands in the most extravagant ecstasy. Hester Prynne likewise had involuntarily looked up, and all of these four persons, old and young, regarded one another in silence till the child laughed aloud and shouted, "Come away, mother! Come away, or yonder old black man will catch you. He has got hold of the minister already. Come away, mother, or he will catch you. But he cannot catch little Pearl." So she drew her mother away, skipping and dancing and frisking fantastically along the hillocks of the dead people, like a creature that had nothing in common with the bygone and buried generation, nor owned herself a kindred. It was as if she had been made afresh out of new elements. Desi, here. We might have to stop. It was as if she had been made afresh out of new elements and must perforce be permitted to live out her own life and be a law unto herself without eccentricities of being reckoned to her for a crime. There goes a woman, resumed Roger Chillingworth after a pause, who, be her demerits what they may, hath none of that mystery of hidden sinfulness which you deem so grievous to be borne. Is Hester Prynne less miserable, think you, for the scarlet letter of her breast? I do verily believe it, answered the clergyman. Nevertheless, I cannot answer for her. There was a look of pain in her face which I would gladly have been spared the sight of, but still methinks it must needs be better for the sufferer to be free to show his pain, as this poor woman, Hester, is, than to cover it all up in his heart. There was another pause, and the physician began anew to examine and arrange the plants which he had gathered. You inquired of me a little time agone, said he, at length, my judgment as touching your health. I did, answered the clergyman, and would gladly learn it. Speak frankly, I pray you. Be it for life or death. Freely then, and plainly, said the physician, still busy with his plants, but keeping a wary eye on Mr. Dimmesdale. The disorder is a strange one, not so much in itself, nor is outwardly manifested, in so far at least as the symptoms have been laid upon to my observation. Looking daily at you, my good sir, and watching the tokens of your aspect now for months gone by, I should deem you a man sore sick. If may be, yet not so sick, but that an instructed and watchful physician might well hope to cure you. But I know not what to say. The disease is what I seem to know, yet know it not. You speak in riddles, learned sir, said the pale minister, glancing aside out of the window. Then, to speak more plainly, continued the physician, I crave pardon, sir, should it seems to require pardon, for this needful plainness of my speech. Let me ask, as your friend, as one having charge under providence of your life and physical well-being, hath all the operation of this disorder been fairly laid open and recounted to me? How can you question it? Asked the minister. Surely it were child's play to call in a physician and then hide the sore. You would tell me then that I know all, said Roger Chillingworth, deliberately, and fixing an eye bright with intense and concentrated intelligence on the minister's face. Be it so, but again, he to whom only the outward and physical evil is laid open knoweth oftentimes but half the evil which he is called upon to cure. A bodily disease which we look upon as a whole and entire within itself may, after all, be but a symptom of some ailment to the spiritual part. Your pardon once again, good sir, if my speech give the shadow of offense. You, sir, of all men whom I have known, are he whose body is closest conjoined with, imbued and identified, so to speak, with the spirit whereof it is the instrument. Then I need to ask no further, said the clergyman, somewhat hastily rising from his chair. You deal not, I take it, in medicine for the soul. Thus the sickness, continued Roger Chillingworth, going on in an unaltered tone, without heeding the interruption, but standing up and confronting the emaciated and white-cheeked minister with his low, dark, and misshapen figures. A sickness, a sore place, if we may so call it, in your spirit, hath immediately its appropriate manifestation in your bodily frame. Would you, therefore, that your physician heal the bodily evil? How may this be unless you first lay open to him the wound and trouble in your soul? Oh, not to an earthly physician, cried Mr. Dimmesdale passionately, and turning his eyes full and bright, and with a kind of fierceness on old Roger Chillingworth. Not to thee, but if it be the soul's disease, then I do commit myself to the one physician of the soul. He, if it stand with his good pleasure, can cure or he can kill. Let him do with me as in his justice and wisdom he shall see good. But who art thou that meddlest in this matter, that dares thrust himself between the sufferer and his God? With a frantic gesture, he rushed out of the room. It is well to have made this step, said Roger Chillingworth to himself, looking after the minister with a grave smile. There is nothing lost. We shall be friends again anon. But see now how passion takes hold upon this man and hurrieth him out of himself. As with one passion, so with another. He hath done a wild thing ere now, this pious Master Dimmesdale, in the hot passion of his heart. It proved not difficult to reestablish the intimacy of the two companions. On the same footing and in the same degree as heretofore. The young clergyman, after a few hours of privacy, was sensible that the disorder of his nerves had hurried him into an unseemly outbreak of temper, which there had been nothing in the physician's words to excuse or palliate. He marveled indeed at the violence with which he had thrust back the kind old man when merely proffering the advice which it was his duty to bestow, and which the minister himself had expressly sought. With these remorseful feelings, he lost no time in making the amplest apologies, and besought his friend still to continue the care which, if not successful in restoring him to health, had, in all probability, been the means of prolonging his feeble existence to that hour. Roger Chillingworth readily assented, and went on with his medical supervision of the minister, doing his best for him in all good faith, but always quitting the patient's apartment at the close of a professional interview, with a mysterious and puzzled smile upon his lips. This expression was invisible to Mr. Dimmesdale's presence, but grew strongly evident as the physician crossed the threshold. A rare case, he muttered. I must needs look deeper into it. A strange sympathy betwixt soul and body. Were it only for the art's sake, I must search this matter to the bottom. It came to pass, not long after the scene above recorded, that the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale, at noonday and entirely unawares, fell into a deep, deep slumber, sitting in his chair, with a large black-letter volume open before him on the table. It must have been a work of vast ability in the somniferous school of literature. The profound depth of the minister's repose was the more remarkable, inasmuch as one of those persons whose sleep ordinarily is as light, as fitful, and as easy scared away as a small bird hopping on a twig. To such an unwonted remoteness, however, he had his spirit now withdrawn into itself, that he stirred not in his chair when old Roger Chillingworth, without any extraordinary precaution, came into the room. The physician advanced directly in front of his patient, laid his hand upon his bosom, and thrust aside the vestment that hitherto had always covered it, even from the professional eye. Then, indeed, Mr. Dimmesdale shuddered and slightly stirred. After a very deep pause, the physician turned away. But with a wild look of wonder, joy, and horror, with what ghastly rapture, as it were, too mightily to be expressed only by the eye and features, and therefore bursting forth the ugliness of his figure and making itself even riotously manifest by the extravagant gestures with which he threw up his arms toward the ceiling and stamped a foot on the floor. Had a man seen old Roger Chillingworth at that moment of ecstasy, he would have had no need to ask how Satan comports himself when a precious human soul is lost to heaven and won into his kingdom. But what distinguished the physician's ecstasy from Satan's was the trait of wonder in it. We're going to stop there for tonight because my dogs are going nuts. But I will see you tomorrow.